Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today, joined by some of my favorite alternate history friends and just some of my favorite people in the world just to hang out a little bit on the internet and talk about some stuff with. So today I'm joined by in no significant order. I made a big point about this, so I almost screwed up there. In no significant order, I'm joined by Dylan Holzimer. I'm joined by both of our Erics. That would be Darling, Bond, and Rush. And I'm joined by Robert Koshu. So we do not have Chris Capola here, so I don't have to do the obligatory say hi to the good people. So we're not going to say hi to the good people. We'll save that for Chris to do again next time. We'll just say hi to all our listeners, and we appreciate you joining us. So Dylan, EDB, Eric Rush, and Robert, we are picking up a topic today that actually has been suggested a couple of different times in a couple of different ways. It was one of the topics that did not get selected, if I remember correctly, for our live stream. And so we're circling back for some of those and picking those up after we did what was there. And so our topic today, our fork today, relates to pretty critical event in history. We were just talking off podcast here about all the ways that this thing impacts a lot of different ways. But we're going to go back to 312 AD, October of 312 AD, if my memory serves correctly. And guess what? There's another Roman civil war going on. Who would have thunk that? Because they divided up the Roman Empire not into two parts, which it eventually will be, but two parts plus subparts inside of the two parts. So really, it's the Tetrarchy. It's in four parts. And we find this guy named Constantine, and we come up to the Battle of Milvian Bridge. And so I'm going to throw it over to Dylan to talk a little bit about the historical what did and set us up for our historical what if. Mr. Holzimer, take us away.
Yeah, so this is 312 CE. This is kind of in the height of the Roman sort of getting stretched into its biggest extent era in terms of they're not so much conquering anymore as just trying desperately to keep the duct tape from fraying off of the various bits and bobs of their empire. The Tetrarchy is the government system that we have now, where you have Diocletian creating this. Originally, it was a dual emperor role, so you'd have an Eastern emperor and a Western emperor, which kind of foreshadows the Roman Empire Episode 7, George Lucas treatment, where you have the Byzantine Empire versus the Roman Empire. But then they also start changing it to where you have real emperors and then like emperors with training wheels on underneath them. So it's really four emperors and they all have territory, but two of them are supposed to listen to the other two, and each has it's a very strange system. I can see what they were trying to go for, but if you try and read about how this was supposed to work in practice, you immediately are not surprised when, as soon as somebody has to actually make this succession work in practice, it just devolves into the Game of Thrones. That's basically what happens. So in 312, Constantine is the son of one of the senior emperors from the second round of the Tetrarchy. And if that didn't make sense, that's perfectly fine because it's not supposed to. He basically got appointed by his dad's army after his dad died and completely sidestepped the normal succession. So that triggers like 30 years of civil war. You have all of these actual emperors, deputy emperors, military commanders all fighting each other, backstabbing, linking up with treaties and then backstabbing again. And basically by the 310s, Constantine he's not the only dog on the block, but he is the big dog kind of consolidating his power. And those of us who've grown up in the sort of Judeo-Christian Western educational paradigm, this is the famous battle where he, has the dream before he comes in hoc signo wing case, to use the classical Roman pronunciation. Basically, Jesus comes to him in a dream and says, "Hey, if you fight for me, I will make sure that you win." And the next day at Milvian Bridge, Constantine has the Cairo symbol of Christianity painted on his soldiers' shields. This is the last victory that unifies his rule over the empire. He then decides a couple years later to make Christianity the state religion of Rome, and then Rome goes from a polytheistic sort of pantheon kind of system with our traditional gods of Jupiter, Mars, all of those fun guys, to having a state religion of Christianity, which then domino effects into the foundation of the current, understanding that we have of the modern Western world. So that's the incredibly long, short version of basically where we're at. The idea for the fork is that what if Constantine did not do any of that? Because without going too far into the weeds yet, his exact date of conversion is kind of up in the air. So no one's entirely sure when or exactly how much he really did convert. So the gist of the fork is basically, what if he didn't?
Right.
What if after this victory he decides not to drink the holy water, so to speak, and continues with the traditional imperial cult, and we'll see where it goes from there.
Yeah. Dylan, you actually did a fantastic job of not only explaining the unexplainable, but making it fun while you did it. So I give you a lot of credit for that. The only 2 points I want to put on the real timeline is uh, there's a question about his actual conversion. There's a deathbed baptism that we sort of know, which brings into question about exactly when. But he certainly did stop persecution that was going on against Christians throughout the empire. Whether the empire actually became Christian is a matter of degrees, because the first thing that happens is edicts that you cannot do things that are adverse against Christians, which was a change from what had been at various points. And then over time, there's more of a formalization. And he definitely calls one of the major events in Christian history, which is the Council of Nicaea, which is 325, to do some things. And we will, we can spend there are whole podcasts around the stuff that are there. So we're not going to try to do that justice, nor can we, except to say that Constantine did play a role in the development of the church after this conversion, whether it was political conversion, an actual conversion, or when it was, and had an impact there. But Dylan, good job there. Any other just initial thoughts there about the real timeline, guys, before we start jumping down the fork in terms of how important Constantine was because of what actually did happen in 312?
I mean, maybe a little bit of that, but what I wanted to talk about a little bit is just where he comes from. Where he is, I mean, what is his domain that he starts out from? And his domain is not Rome. I mean, it's part of the Roman Empire, but he rules over, before he consolidates power, Britain, Gaul, and Spain. So these are kind of, in many cases, sort of backwaters of the Roman Empire. So his strength was happened for other reasons, and it always kind of strikes me as very unusual that when he takes power as emperor, he is not in Rome, and in fact, he is about as far from Rome as you can get. He was in Eboracum. He was in York in northern England. And so that's a long ways away from Rome, but yet he managed to consolidate power. I don't know. And that's kind of, I mean, admittedly, that's not necessarily as important to what we're talking about today, but it just strikes me as very interesting how deftly he played the political game to go from, being in, he immediately was promoted to an Augustus, a senior emperor role, but he bypassed the junior emperor role of Caesar in doing so. And so in actuality, he jumped the line in a way that was pretty dangerous.
Yeah, and jumped the line because he won this battle. The credit is given to there. So put it in context there. So again, I mentioned there's no doubt that Constantine is an influential persona in Roman history and an influential persona in what becomes church history in the 4th century and moving forward. But we've just now pulled him away from having this conversion experience. So we're the alternate history, folks. So the alternate timeline here is that he is not a professing Christian. Dylan, you had suggested in some of the show notes that we were looking at, and the ideas that we had here is that maybe he tries to co-opt some of the things that are there, but doesn't actually make that conversion, right?
Yeah, because the Romans have this sort of practice of doing this. If you study, the comparisons between Hellenic, sort of, Macedonian Empire and, like classical Hellenism versus Roman theology, the Romans basically just stuck, they copied the homework and just changed the names just enough to hope that the teacher would give them a passing grade. They did the same thing in the Punic Wars because they needed to figure out how boats worked. So they basically just took the Etruscan idea of building something that wouldn't sink when you put it in water and then just copied that. So this is not a far-fetched idea that they would do this, because that's sort of how the Romans structured their government. They would absorb all of these different areas that had all these various religions. And the Romans, in a lot of ways, were kind of sort of the progenitor early model, along with the Persians, of kind of doing this, where for the most part, as long as you paid your taxes, they really didn't care. Historically, a lot of the problems that the Christians originally faced with persecution from Rome is because early Christian leaders, after the death of Jesus, would instruct their Roman sort of believers to not pay homage that some of the Roman emperors wanted. And we're talking some of the emperors like Nero and Caligula, the ones who were, sort of arrogant to a point of thinking they were gods to begin with. So understandable that they would have that problem. But that was really the only reason why Roman theology probably wouldn't incorporate Christianity more already. So the theory is just sort of, what if Constantine, using his new consolidated position that he has, he's already, he issues the Edict of Milan, even though he doesn't even really, I don't think, deserve all the credit for that, because his co-emperor Licinius had already done a bunch of that stuff anyway in terms of issuing some other decrees. But just for the sake of argument and keeping this easy, Constantine, instead of fully wholeheartedly adopting Christianity as the religion, he instead kind of co-opts some of the precepts and principles, using them as a base of support and allowing them, instead of adopting them in place of current Roman pantheon theology, he sort of tries to incorporate, one, obviously Jesus and his teachings into it, but also some of the structures of the church into a Roman pantheon that, for the most part, at this point, is basically just a bunch. It's like what you see in Gladiator. It's just a bunch of wooden statues people carry around and pray to in their own house. There's not a whole lot of sort of the modern liturgical aspects of what we would consider a church today.
Right.
So does he pass the edict? 'Cause this becomes important. So if you read the history of Constantine, there are some scholars that say Mama raised him and converted him, and there are some scholars that say he converted his mother. Does Mom's faith play a role in him doing that? Because that's going to play out later in the fork in my mind.
So I think, unless we want to pull an Eric Rush and kill his mother, which presents other timeline problems that we're not going
he doesn't
to
want
do.
to kill anybody tonight. Okay. It's not a president.
And then we start getting into time paradox territory, which we have avoided for 200 episodes, so we like to keep it that way. I think
only presidents in chief.
That's a new T-shirt right there. I think we have to account for her being around, and I think regardless of which way the conversion goes, I think the Edict of Milan still happens.
Yes.
Okay.
If only, at a minimum, because of a sort of Bismarckian realpolitik,
Right.
Consolidation, getting the Christians on your side and having a good power base, because as he's moving east from where he's getting started in Spain and France and Britain, he's moving into the classic early Christian heartland when he's trying to consolidate his power. Once you go across, the Greek colonial cities where a lot of the epistles and the early theological, dispersion came from.
Right.
So this is very much a local power base that he has to court to keep, his power sort of consolidated and stable.
Does he give Mom the money to do the trip? Would be my next question. Because she goes into Palestine, she identifies the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Nativity.
There's another T-shirt there. It's the Helena World Tour. I mean, with her pointing out, and this happened there, and this happened there, and this happened there.
But that's actually a question here to ask. If they don't adapt, because he gives her basically a title and opens the treasury up for this to take place, where she identified beifies and also constructs several of these: Church of the Nativity, Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the church that's on the Mount of Olives, Church of Ellen. I was trying to think of its name. But if she's not around, do all of those places get, because boy, we're talking about a long-term fork into the history of Jerusalem at that point.
Yeah, my answer to that, Robert, is sort of just carrying
Okay.
Dylan's idea along. Is that's maybe some of the way that it actually gets this amalgamation taking place. She, yeah, I get the feeling she was a genuine believer. At what point moving
I
forward.
agree.
And so, so it's just, again, the Edict of Milan and the other things that are there. Toleration has now become the nature of the official position of the empire, backed by edict that makes it, a little bit stronger than just the whim of. Although there will be future emperors that try to go back. That does happen, a little not too far down the road. But I think it plays out that way in terms of her having a role. He helps fund that. It's mom, right? I mean, why not do that? And to Dylan's point, this is just putting another, tacking another row onto the onto the whatever it is in terms of what's going on there. Eric DB, you were about to say something about. I wanted to ask a question.
I was going to say, I always like to put the question of like, so how much did he know about Christianity? Because at this time, like we'll see in the Nicene, the Conference of Nicaea, there's going to be a ton of debate about, well, the Trinity, the nature of Jesus and his relationship with God, and all of that. And Constantine, in our timeline, tried his best to get everybody to just get on the very basic same page and then banish all the other people who didn't agree with that same page once he got tired. But, we're dealing with a guy who has a very basic concept of what Christianity is from his mother, and then versus the very academic. Could we say that maybe the Council of Nicaea is what causes him to take a step back and say, oh, this was a lot more complicated than I thought. Maybe I'm better staying put with just trying to create an imperial cult where I am the patron, or I am like the receiver of a patron god like the previous Roman emperors had done, namely during the 3rd century crisis, how each one of them had started saying like, yeah, I believe in the Hellenistic system, but we have Sol Invictus, who is like our patron of the emperorship.
Yeah, my without getting too far, because I could easily go way down the theological rabbit hole here and to places that I may care about and others may care about, but I'm guessing the majority of our listeners don't. The only thing I will say is that, we have this concept and again, I'm a Christian, been raised in that tradition, been educated in that tradition, but also have explored other things and think of myself as being the type of person who has applied scholarship to that, not just, what I was taught as a kid, although that's valuable to me. I'll just say that right up front because I think it's an important place to understand where I'm coming from and where I'm not. But this idea of what we in Christianity, there's the idea of what is orthodox, right? Which is part of what was trying to be achieved there with the Council of Nicaea is what falls within the bounds and what's coloring outside the box and what is too far outside the box. And I think it's a very insightful question, Eric, because there were definitely competing mainstream thoughts. There were two primary mainstream thoughts that were going on throughout most of the Christian world that existed there, and there were the various the 5 centers of Christianity that rise not far after this, where you sort of had various powers that were there. But then there were tons of smaller subsets of those. Call them denominations or call them, other elements of that. And to your point, eventually there comes to be an agreement at Nicaea, Eric, about some fundamental things. But the reason you then follow that up with several other councils over the next 250 to 300 years is, okay, we've identified the Jesus God question. Now, what's this Holy Spirit question? We got to come back to that. So this is an evolving thing over time. And I could easily see the political Constantine going, I just need to get this to a nice level state, and I'm not going to get in the middle of all this. So I could easily see that being the case.
Right. And it started with a bishop who was being excommunicated, basically doing a letter to the emperor at the last minute and said, hey, I got expelled, and there were more guys there it was supposed to be a fair trial. Can you weigh in, Emperor Constantine, since you seem to be sympathetic?
Well, and
us,
you have to remember he's the legal head of the Roman religion because he's the Pontifex Maximus. That's
Right.
The emperors won't divest themselves of that title for another 50 years. So from a strictly political position, he has every right under Roman precedent to start screwing with whatever religious stuff he feels like.
That is true. It was just a question because at this point, at least during the 3rd century crisis, Christian churches were there and they were seen as a supplement to like taking care of the poor and the ill because the state was in such a disrepair from the various civil wars. So, which is part of the reason why Christianity became so expansive within the Roman Empire, of just like, yeah, they're fine people. They gave me a bowl of soup in a bread bowl one time. Great folks. I don't see why we have to hunt them down as some emperors would have. You know, it essentially just became them being made into part of the state. If I'm not grossly mischaracterizing everything.
No, not at all. I think it's exactly right.
Yeah.
Well, it was that, and they were known for going and grabbing babies in the middle of the night and protecting when they were set out to be exposed. That was one of their big. That was actually one of the big things Christians became. That and having, according to the Romans, very uptight sexual, ethical, moral values. Is the other,
according to the Romans being the important caveat to that.
Well, and that was the caveat I put on it. But then if you're looking at it, so he's recognizing this, and there was a very big segment of the Roman legions were basically Don's Mishras group and then Christians, and that was kind of the two things that the Roman soldiers believed, and so catering to the Christianity and adopting it as Romans wanted to, I think actually fits Constantine's personality. Because like we talked about, we're talking about a deathbed baptism, conversion of dubious, thing. Basically, my theory is he had the inkling of the belief, but he was going along to keep mom happy from a religious standpoint.
And it worked well politically.
Yeah. Any of the extra face stuff happened because of mom, but politically, it works in his favor as he does that. So, I think it's a good time to start moving the fork along. So Constantine, Edict of Milan happens. Mom still gets to go on the Helena's world tour to pick the sites. He still funds it because, hey, why not? Maybe we slap a few extra Roman eagles on all the sites, though. So they look a little different, because we got to acknowledge the Roman part of it. So Constantine dies. Constantinus, if I said that correctly, takes over. He's not around long, but Julian takes over. How does that end up playing? Because Julian wanted to totally trash out everything anyway and move back to, so he doesn't get to back to anymore. Now he's getting to back in.
Well, I think sorry, go ahead, Eric.
Well, there's less of a distance to go now, right? Because you have, you kind of have this halfway, and it's not even a conversion, sort of a middle ground for Rome between the kind of the old ways and introducing some elements of Christianity, enough tolerance to keep most people happy, and Constantine was a pretty astute politician, so this is something we could easily see him doing. There'd be less to change under Julian.
So what? I guess my question, what I've been noodling around. Which is more different, the Rome that comes forth from here, or the Christian church that, in terms of not recognizing it compared to the real timeline? Which is the one that gets altered more? What Rome becomes, or what the church becomes, if Constantine doesn't quote unquote convert?
I wonder if Christianity becomes more disparate, more quickly. because you could argue that Constantine's influence had a significant Catholicizing effect. Catholicizing means sort of universally,
Right.
kind of a universal Christianity, and so you would have Arianism, you would have Nestorian Christians. I think you would have a lot more flavors of Christianity, and then so there might be more kind of regional. And there already were kind of regional Christianity sects. I mean, think about the Celtic Christians in Ireland, things like
Right.
that. But I think that probably happens a bit more broadly if there isn't a force for a Council of Nicaea or something similar to that.
Yeah, and again, Eric, not chasing the theology too far, but the Arian thought persists for a long time in the real timeline after this.
Yeah.
It's just it finds itself more, as you mentioned, in the British Isles, in the Scandinavian. I mean, that the Scandinavian versions of Christianity fall more into this category. In the old empire proper, if you will, what had been the Roman Empire, what Orthodox had become was Arianism was not part of our orthodoxy, and so that changed. So I think you're. I mean, I totally agree. I think you see these other flavors of what is clearly recognized as Christianity, but does have distinctive theological elements to it, being more prevalent, and that there's not one, little C Catholic becoming big C Catholic version of Christianity, maybe ever. Or at least it's
the Catholic Church does not exist as we know it without.
Yeah, or at least it's a long ways further down the road where other things have happened. And you raised an interesting question that sort of leads to that, Eric. When we were talking before podcast, we could spend this and multiple episodes talking about the influence on Western culture flowing out of this, and there's plenty to go there. But that would also be ignoring the fact that, another major world religion. First of all, there's another major world religion at the same time right now that this is going on, in the sense of what is prevalent and what had been Persia and what is now the Sassanid Empire. One of the questions that was actually asked by the person that suggested this topic was, what if Constantine had converted to Mazdaism or Zoroastrianism? There's a lot of different ways you could describe that versus Christianity. And the similarity there is they're both monotheistic. I will use that term broadly, because what goes on inside of the dualism of Zoroastrianism, without again chasing theological things, is a little bit different. But the question was, what if he had chosen a different major religious path? But the thing you suggested that I want to get to, Eric, because I think it's the most interesting thing, is the world's about to be set on fire in terms of a massive spread of religion, and that's going to be Islam. That's going to happen about 400 years down the road here. And there is influence from Christianity and Judaism into the foundation of Islam. If you don't have Christianity sitting where it is at the time of Muhammad, what difference does that make?
Christianity was sorry, Dylan, go ahead. Christianity was ascendant. I mean, at this point, and you do wonder if there is more, we'll say, freedom for different types of Christianity. Would it even spread further? And specifically, I'm thinking about other parts outside the empire. If we think about where Christianity was in our timeline, it was Egypt, what we consider now kind of Israel, Palestine, Lebanon. Those areas were Christian, or were largely Christian anyway. Does it spread into the Arabian Peninsula? And I don't know the answer to that, but it certainly could, because there is I think missionaries might feel tremendous freedom in spreading their kind of their interpretation of Christianity.
So I have there's not really a good answer to this, so I'm just going to kind of throw this out there and see what kind of chaos we get ourselves into, as is my preferred method on this podcast, as we're discovering. So if you have a Roman pantheon that's much more a-Catholic, I guess is the word that we're going to go with. It's much more diverse and disparate. what does that do to the stability of the empire going forward? Because, you know, it probably wasn't a ginormous, like a singular factor in the preservation of Rome for the next couple hundred years, but it probably has more than we would like to admit in terms of giving the Roman administrative state something, another leg to stand on in terms of a unified singular Catholic Church. So I'm curious what we think, one, especially as we start looking towards when Islam comes around, because at that point, the Western Roman Empire is gone. It's a smoldering ash heap in the history books, to put it, hyperbolically. But, does that happen earlier instead of later? If we have a sort of Roman pantheon, do you see it sort of more scattershot? Instead of, one big empire, do we have sort of kind of more Roman, but not Roman, kingdoms or empires, with like an Italian sort of, Western Roman, like Illyria, sort of the Levant, and then kind of an Anatolian state as these sort of bigger chunks, when the Roman top starts to spin, because you've got all these emperors who are belonging to different religions and they're converting and deconverting and reconverting. And it's basically just a hot mess after another 50 years.
Well, when you actually use the word stability, I didn't want to laugh out loud, but I laughed in my head because I don't think of the Western part of the Roman Empire being, at this point, even in 312, it's not stable. The very reason that this is happening, but certainly by the time we have the pressure coming from the Goths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, all the stuff that's going to happen as the quote unquote barbarians, start showing up and wreaking havoc. Rome actually being sacked and all the things that go from there. Pick your date. You can pick from among several as to when you actually have the fall of the Western part of the Roman Empire. But the stability that does exist, though, which I think is relevant to your question, is the eastern half of the empire. What becomes the Byzantine Empire is stable. The Eastern Orthodox Church, even after the schism inside of Christianity, is stable for a long period of time. And my short answer to your question is, Dylan, I think it has a tremendous impact, a tremendous destabilizing impact, because one of the things that at least it provided, even while there was quote unquote heresy and even while there was differences that were going on, it provided a sense of commonality that would not have existed. And so you wouldn't have had, one of the things that holds a society together, just in my take, is there's political reasons that societies hold together. There are ethnic and cultural reasons that societies hold together. And if you take one of those, legs of the tripod away, in this case, it's a shared religious understanding, you've made a more unstable situation. That's just my thought. I could be wrong.
Yeah, well, and the reason why I went there is because, when we started talking earlier about sort of where the Christian power base is that's what got me thinking about it, is because all of those Greek, sort of, for lack of a better word, Christian colony cities, they're in what's going to be the Eastern Roman Empire. They're other than Rome itself and maybe Syracuse, there's not much in the Western part that is a strong, early couple hundred CE Catholic power base. So that's exactly where my mind was going.
But what does grow out of that, because of the fall of the Western Empire and because of the things that happen and the Franks and other things that are there, we eventually land on what happens in Gaul, what happens in France. Eventually we get to Charlemagne, right? And clearly that's Christian, in the sense that we think of what it is, and eventually he becomes what? He becomes the, if Chris were here, he would say it, so I'll say it, the Holy Roman Emperor. It's neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, right? Particularly, but that is decidedly the heritage of that Western Christian mode of thought. If you don't have that, it's not so much maybe that you don't have the rise of a Byzantine Empire. That may happen, regardless either way. You don't have a Charlemagne, or or something Charlemagne-esque. And I must admit that's a period of history that was not covered well for me in my early days, so I've come to it later. But when you start really realizing what happened there around 800, AD CE, again, whichever you want to use, that's big stuff. You take that out of the picture, that's big stuff.
Well, even more fundamentally for that, do we have what we would recognize as a true Frankish kingdom? or do things destabilize in a completely different way earlier in the West?
I think it destabilizes. It looks like it does now, where you've got, well, now in the sense of you have various sects in various areas being controlled. You never get a united, quote unquote, Europe or Southern Europe at all, ever. It stays tribal with Visigoths and Goths and everybody else running their own little pieces together as you look at it, because there's no one is powerful enough to take it over and establish it.
Except,
okay.
There's a very famous Viking who's about to show up on the beaches of France. I'm not saying it's likely that they're going to create something that is long lived, but this is the early days, especially as we talk around Charlemagne and the beginning of the Carolingians. This is the beginning of this great wave of Viking expansion, especially when you start comparing, because what we've basically done is we've turned northwestern continental Europe into essentially the same sort of decentralized kind of power structure that England has at this time period,
Mhm.
Right.
where you have a much more fractured power base. So do we have another sort of, Jarldom of Jorvik in Normandy, just for the sake of keeping things sort of parallelist to the timeline? I think you may see the Vikings have much more influence than we traditionally understand in our timeline, just from a cultural perspective, because you have, because you don't have this unified Christian church that can spread all the way up into France and function as an additional unification tool for the Carolingians.
Mhm.
You keep much more of that, like, kind of Druidic, Celtic sort of, polytheistic theology that is much more kind of akin to what the Vikings are dealing with anyway. I think that's when that starts getting really interesting.
So does Odin get duct taped into the pot into the
Well, so there's actually a theory. This is one of my favorite pet theories. There's a supposed link between Aeneas. No, is it Aeneas? No, there's a supposed link between one of the guys who runs away from the Trojan War and Odin. There is actually a weird theory that says that Odin or one of the other Norse gods is a survivor of Troy and somehow got all the way up into the Arctic to start the Viking religion, basically. It's crazy. I don't believe a word of it, but it's such a cool theory. I can't stop thinking about it.
And that just really upsets my Marvel universe too, which makes it
Yeah, I was going to say.
And just think of Thor in a toga, and that's basically what we have.
Ooh, I think we're there. I think we just named it. I think we just named the episode Thor in a Toga. I think we just named it, guys. Something else may come along. And I also just realized here, as I was even referencing Charlemagne, I skipped over something that goes back to Eric's point that he made off podcast we were talking, is that, the Carolingians arise as a result of being the stopping point and then the pushback point on the massive Islamic expansion that comes up through Iberia. The Battle of Tours, I think, is 722. So that's a precursor to, Charles Martel and that whole thing coming along, because they're the elements of Christianity that is fighting back this rapidly expanding Islamic caliphate that is just on fire. Derek, you mentioned those maps of the world. You see them. You don't even have to animate them. You just do them year by year, like stop action animation. They look like they're blowing up just because of how fast it happens. And again, if there's not that unified thing to get around, maybe it's just as easy to say, hey, okay, we can find a way to make this Mohammed thing fit into this other stuff that we're doing too. Again, this idea of this continual blending of things might just continue even beyond that.
Yeah, there's certainly not. Let's assume that Islam happens the way it did in our timeline. Then I think you have the same wildfire, but it doesn't stop in Iberia. There's no way it stops in Iberia.
It continues on.
It continues on, at least into southern France, probably into Italy. I'm just thinking about where would be a stopping point. Where would there be any sort of cohesive resistance? And maybe if you do have that kind of Viking influence, maybe you do have the ability to stop it in northern France, where they have a little more influence. I don't know the answer to that exactly, but I think you definitely have significantly more of an Islamic influence on Southern Europe.
And again, to be the real long tails of any of these types of things, if you go back far enough into what becomes among the, I had a professor once that described it this way: the root system of Western culture, the Western civilization. The idea is there's not just one single path there. These are all the things together that support, that tree of Western civilization. Is and obviously the Christian church is part of that. The political entity that was Rome is part of that. There's the other things that go on with that. Is that once you cut one of those roots up in a major way, the interplay between all that is just very, very different. If there's especially if the influence doesn't carry over, where you don't really have the Eastern Church or what becomes the Byzantine Empire. Rome doesn't fall when Rome falls. Rome falls when when Constantinople and Byzantium finally falls, which is much, much later. It's 1,000 years later. But if you don't have that, who stops the Mongols? Who stops the other things that are going on there? For example.
But when does Byzantium fall? Because you think about the reasons why Byzantium fell, and there are direct relationships to the Crusades, which don't happen here, presumably.
Right.
To the Doge of Venice in a couple of instances, which I don't know, maybe there still is a Doge of Venice in this timeline, but I kind of doubt it. So there are reasons to suspect that there may be a longer persistence of Byzantium. That would be, I mean, empires don't generally last that long, but it'd be interesting could we see a Byzantium into closer to the modern day.
That's why I'm going to say Manichaeism. Manichaeism eventually catches wildfire with no unified church in Rome, because they are all busy fighting each other in local sects. As what also necessitated the Council of Nicaea is that a lot of groups could not stand the fact that there were other groups calling themselves Christian. So Manichae, with his credit card-sized teachings and syncretism, takes over as the next popular figure. Someone who incorporates Christianity and also Buddhism, and very much probably influenced by Zoroastrianism as well.
I actually really like that.
You like vegetables, because we're going to be eating.
Yeah, I like that a lot, because that was the other thing I was thinking of with the Zoroastrian thing, and the sort of change in focus is the Romans are still going to go after Parthia, because Crassus still got killed. They got to go get vengeance. So they're going to go that way. They're going to get exposed to some of this stuff. So, I mean, there's, no telling sort of how far east an Eastern Roman Empire in this sort of, Roman Empire 2 Syncretion Boogaloo sort of turns out to be.
I don't even think that.
Dylan's just shooting for another podcast episode title right there.
Well, I don't even know that matters.
Well, in my world, the Roman Empire shifts from Rome to Constantinople.
Exactly.
And we don't refer to the Byzantium Empire as the Byzantine Empire. It is just Rome moved to here at some point in our history.
Well, and even if you talked in the real timeline to folks that were there, they consider themselves Roman, because again, the name that we're talking about is Constantine. Constantinople as a result of Constantine relocating the empire center. But you ask somebody, I don't know, in Constantinople in 1300 AD, give or take, and they would tell you we're Roman. Yeah, but but they're far. But no, we're Roman, and because it had continued through there and altered the way that it was. But again, I keep thinking back to that professor that I had in college that talked about this. Is those big tap roots of Western civilization. The church is one of them. The Roman Empire is another one. And because of what Constantine did here, they got intertwined in a way that it's tough to break them apart later. You just can't do it effectively. You can, but you can't sort of at the same time. And that's why it's really hard, I think, to even look down. Now, I was thinking about this before because I don't know where this goes because I don't have enough imagination to imagine one without the other because that's just the reality that is such the reality that it's hard to get away from.
Well, we know Constantinople is likely, if not the most cosmopolitan city in the world at this point, is certainly one of them. Crossroads of trade, crossroads of culture. It's just it's a setup for exactly the sort of syncretic religion that Eric was talking about. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I just wonder, I'm thinking about this as far as how this plays out for the far future. I wonder if we have a Europe that fails to coalesce into relatively large and powerful nation states, i.e., is there ever a concept of a France? Is there ever a concept of a Germany, a concept of an Italy, or are they just these disparate nation states?
And you would argue there, I would state this as a statement, but in the form of a question: the church, as we know it in the real timeline, had a big part in creating the concept of the nation state because of how things were organized. So if you pull that out, you don't have one of the major formation factors of that, right?
Right. I think conceptually the church supported that, and they also supported specific rulers. They also, if you had the blessing of the Pope, hey, that's a good thing to have if you're trying to consolidate power. And that's and there's no Pope to have that from. It's much more of a pitched battle.
Yep.
There's no one consolidating, so you end up with nothing but a bunch of little chaos.
Or
throughout Europe.
If there's no strong European resistance in say about 1,000 years from now, do the Mongols stick around for a little bit longer? Do we start seeing and what I'm more getting at is, do you have sort of a Mongol occupied Western Europe like you had a sort of Mongol occupied sort of Russian principalities, and do we end up kind of veering along that path developmentally?
Possibly, although I still think that there's going to be a lot of there could be a caliphate in France, or what we understand as France at this point, and there's likely not going to be quite as much of a harkening back to last week. Is there an analogy to the Reconquista? And probably not. I mean, or maybe not.
Or so, and now we're kind of getting into, and I'm in no way qualified to get on this, but do you have, so the Roman Empire, the head of the empire is the Pontifex Maximus. Well, one of the two primary strains of Islam dictates that the caliph must be a descendant of the prophet. So do you have do you have Roman emperors at some point trying to essentially marry into the family of the prophet, so that you have a sort of Roman imperial caliphate versus a Sunni caliphate that's not necessarily related by direct bloodline to the prophet? I think that could be, that sets up a conflict that's more, along the lines of, at least kind of conceptually, sort of a Greek Orthodox versus a Roman Catholic sort of duopoly in our timeline. I think there's all sorts of theological problems there that I don't really want to get into because I am not qualified to talk about them. But in terms of a setup, and you can understand how emperors might want to do that to add a sense of stability after the rise of Islam, just like how we're saying Constantine does in this sort of forked timeline.
Yeah, and you hit upon it in your intro, Dylan. One of the things that Rome struggled with all the way through, because they were because of the republic aspect, they claim to be a republic even once they were an empire, kind of thing for so long, part of what's here. But you mentioned in the setup is that what Rome never sort of figured out was the peaceful transfer of power. They never got that one solved. Just never. They tried all kinds of different things. This tetrarchy was another version of that. The empire's too big for one person to really, be at the top. Communication doesn't move fast enough. So we have to do this other thing. They just never figured that out, ever. And by the way, a lot of other places around the world never did either, except by, monarchy, and then, having dynasties that rise and fall that go in the process. But to your point, Dylan, this idea of somehow connecting you to, because that's what actually did happen, around the time of the 1st century AD, is that people are constantly getting married and divorced and married because that you had to sort of, be related in some way to the Julian Claudian line to sort of get there. So you had to get into it. So I think it's easy to see that extending somewhere further down the line and then having another flip to it that may or may not have a religious element to it, or the idea of the Pontifex Maximus kind of thing playing into that, which is, you got to be in the priestly family to be in the priestly family, and that's the ruling family, so that's what you got to be, right?
Yeah.
Oh, have we stuck a fork in this one?
Yeah, I think we've got some really interesting divergences here.
Yeah,
I do have one final thought, and this, as of course, this is a completely useless thing to end the podcast on, which is why it's perfect. I do want to point out that the most significant change out of all the things that we've talked about is that the Four Lads will not have the second greatest novelty song of all time, because Istanbul will, in fact, not be Constantinople.
The ripples never cease. That's the thing that I learned from here. The ripples never cease. Again, we did this episode today because it was suggested by a listener a couple of different times from listeners, and we wanted to go down this path. One of the other things that we're doing, we mentioned this in our live stream and sort of things we're doing forward, about we're not sure what the frequency is going to be. Once every couple of months, we're going to come back and do sort of a listener feedback show where we take what's come in from our listeners, primarily in our Discord, and sort of bring those thoughts forward. This episode literally begs for our listeners to pop in and pick up on some of these threads and if you will, flush them out a little bit more about where they can go. To borrow, I think, the analogy, Dylan, from our episode last week, we talked about getting on the traffic circle of history here, and we could have taken all the little spins off of that. This one's a much bigger circle that has plenty more side roads that come off of it. And so I'd like to throw out a challenge to our audience, if I'm allowed to do so, which is, if you're not participating in our Discord server, we'd love to have you go there. You can check it out. The links are in the show notes. You can find it on the website, www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. But this is exactly the kind of episode that when we post, we have a channel there called Episode Feedback. This is exactly where we'd love you to pick up on the thoughts here. Tell us what we got wrong. I know we got stuff wrong. Tell us what we got right. I think we got some stuff right. Tell us what we just totally missed, because I know we definitely missed some stuff. And this is the perfect one for us to circle back around once we've heard from our listenership and sort of come back around to it with some new thoughts that are beyond. I'll speak for myself, because I'm looking at some really smart people on the screen here. What little bit my feeble mind can get its head around on this is hard, because this is one of those harder forks to go down. So, anybody have any thoughts on that or anything else before I close this out? All right, good stuff. As always, guys, we appreciate you as listeners. Again, I encourage you to check out the webpage. Check out all the stuff that's in the show notes there that leads you to where we are. I know we're planning our next Room Where It Happened. I like where that's going in terms of what we're going to do there. It's timely and interesting. On top of that, we're drifting into summer here. I sit in Houston, Texas, where we're enjoying a 111 degree heat index today. So it's definitely summer. And we know that our listeners will be busy out doing that. So we're going to try to have at least enough stuff for you to listen to in the car and listen to that on the beach as we go through, but also enjoying our time off. So, Robert, I'm going to throw this to you. We have a suggestion for our listeners if they happen upon a fork in time. Do you have any advice for them?
They need to take it.
I agree. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.